The Grand Hall of Concordance hung suspended in the dark expanse of the orbital capital, a sprawling cathedral of black glass and polished obsidian. Beneath the vaulted ceilings, thousands of stars burned with cold indifference, casting their pale light over the assembled nobility of the empire. It was a space designed to make individuals feel infinitesimally small, and tonight, it served that purpose with ruthless efficiency. Hundreds of dignitaries, draped in silks and ceremonial armor, stood in absolute, suffocating silence. They had gathered for an ancient ritual, one that had long ago devolved from a sacred union into a public execution of dignity. They were here to witness the choosing of a bondmate for Lady Soren Kalis. She stood at the exact center of the hall, isolated on a circular dais of white marble. Soren was a vision of terrifying grace. Her posture was flawless, her expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. Yet, beneath the pale, almost translucent surface of her skin, faint luminescent pathways pulsed with erratic energy. They were neural ridges, glowing with a soft, bioluminescent blue that flared and flickered like an overloaded circuit board. It was the only betrayal of the immense, crushing weight she was bearing. The public humiliation was a physical pressure, pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let them see her break. Around her, the air was thick with a polite, venomous dread. No one shouted insults. No one threw objects or spat at her feet. That would have been too warm, too passionate. Instead, she was subjected to the absolute zero of imperial courtesy. It was this flawless, sterile politeness that made the spectacle so deeply agonizing. They did not look at her as a woman, nor even as a citizen. They looked at her as an unexploded munition resting in the center of their grand parlor. The master of ceremonies, a tall and skeletal figure adorned in the crimson robes of the high court, struck his staff against the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous space. "Lord Valen of the House of Kor," the master intoned, his voice amplified by the acoustic architecture of the hall. A male of Soren's own species stepped forward from the inner circle. He was striking, broad-shouldered and elegant, his eyes lowered in a perfectly calculated display of deference. "Before you stands the living anchor," the master declared, reciting the mandatory legal and biological warnings. "To link your neural architecture with hers is to tie your mind to the veil network. Be warned. The temporal displacement may fracture your ego. The sheer volume of navigational data may shred your organic memories. You risk the dissolution of your identity. You risk the echoes of space and time silencing your own heartbeat. Do you accept the bond?" The hall held its collective breath. Valen looked up. His eyes met Soren's for a fraction of a second. In his gaze, there was no malice, only an insurmountable, primitive terror. He bowed deeply, the fabric of his cloak whispering against the polished floor. "I am unworthy of such a profound burden," he murmured. The words were a traditional formality, a beautiful wrapping paper over a coward's retreat. He took 3 steps backward, vanishing into the safety of his peers. Soren did not blink. The blue pathways beneath her skin flared just a fraction brighter, a silent testament to the sting of rejection. The whispers began to ripple through the outer rings of the audience, hushed and frantic. They rustled like dry leaves in a graveyard. Everyone knew the stories. They spoke of the last man who had tried to bond with a living anchor over 2 centuries ago. They whispered that within 48 hours, his brain had been reduced to ash by the space-time echoes. His consciousness stretched across millions of light-years until there was nothing left but an empty shell. Soren was the only one left. She was the sole surviving biological conduit, capable of safely navigating the Empire's immense network of interstellar portals. Without her, the Veil network would collapse, trade routes would sever, and the Empire would slowly starve in the dark. She possessed a power so vital that the Emperor himself could not order her execution. Yet she was a hazard so severe that no man would willingly touch her hand. She was a god to be prayed to, and a monster to be kept behind thick glass. At the very edge of the grand hall, standing near a towering pillar of frosted glass, Rowan Mercer watched the tragedy unfold. He was a human, a mid-level logistics specialist sent from Earth to oversee cargo routing agreements. Amidst the sea of towering, elegant alien aristocrats, his presence was entirely unremarkable. He wore a simple, dark gray suit, his hands resting casually in his pockets. Yet, his demeanor stood in stark contrast to the reserved, fearful tension of the alien delegations. Rowan was not intimidated by the grandeur, nor was he swept up in the mystical dread of the ritual. He watched with a sharp, analytical intensity. To the nobles, this was a tragic but necessary tradition, a sorrowful decree of fate. To Rowan, it was a catastrophic failure of resource management. He looked at Soren and did not see a cursed witch or a terrifying deity. He saw a critical infrastructure node operating beyond its thermal limits without a heat sink. He saw an incredibly resilient woman being ground into dust by the very people who depended on her for their survival. The master of ceremonies struck his staff again. "Lord Kalen of the Outer Marches." Another male stepped forward. The terrifying warnings were read aloud. The perfectly angled bow was executed. The polite retreat was made. It took exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes for the entire roster of eligible nobles to cycle through the humiliation. One by one, they stepped up to the edge of the marble dais. One by one, they offered their perfect, polite apologies. One by one, they abandoned her. The luminous tracks along Soren's neck and arms were now pulsing with an aggressive, jagged rhythm, mirroring the severe neurological strain of maintaining her composure while tethered to the sleeping portal network. When the final name was called, a young, trembling aristocrat who could barely maintain eye contact before stammering his refusal, a heavy, suffocating finality settled over the room. The ritual had failed. Again. Soren would remain unbonded, continuing to bear the crushing weight of the portal network alone until her mind eventually shattered. The Empire would buy itself a few more years, maybe a decade, at the cost of her sanity. The master of ceremonies lowered his staff, preparing to deliver the closing benediction that would officially seal Soren's isolation. The surrounding nobles began to shift their weight, a subtle relaxation of posture now that the imminent biological danger had passed. They had survived another season. They could go back to their opulent palaces and pretend they were not complicit in the slow, agonizing murder of their savior. It was a scene of absolute, quiet devastation. Then, from the shadows of the outer pillars, a voice cut through the silence. It was not loud, but it possessed the rough, unpolished resonance of earth vocal cords, entirely devoid of imperial melody. It carried clearly across the perfectly tuned acoustics of the hall, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a steel blade. "The problem is not that she is too dangerous," Rowan said, speaking more to himself than anyone else, though his voice betrayed a deep, simmering frustration. "It is that not a single person in this room has the spine to shoulder even a fraction of that danger." He had not meant to project his voice so far. It was the involuntary grumble of a mechanic watching a team of highly decorated engineers debate theology while their main fusion engine was actively catching fire. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The master of ceremonies froze, his mouth hanging half open. The hushed whispers of the nobility died instantly, replaced by a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. The flawless, polite facade of the Empire shattered into a million invisible pieces. Slowly, like a massive ocean tide turning violently against the shore. The collective gaze of the Grand Hall shifted. Hundreds of faces, previously locked in expressions of fearful pity toward the woman on the dais, now pivoted toward the far edge of the room. The oppressive weight of their attention lifted completely from Soren Kalis. Instead, every single eye in the vast, starlit cathedral found the solitary human, standing by the pillar, the only creature in the entire empire who had dared to break the suffocating silence. Rowan let out a slow breath, pulling his hands from his pockets as the crushing weight of 100 alien empires descended squarely onto his shoulders. The promenade of the orbital capital was a masterpiece of intimidating architecture, an endless sweep of transparent silicates and vaulted ceilings that offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the gas giant below. Typically, it was a place for the Empire's elite to stroll, network, and pretend they were not suspended in a vacuum. Today, however, it felt more like a gauntlet. Rowan Mercer walked with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark gray suit, acutely aware of the sudden drops in conversation as he passed. Alien aristocrats, draped in fabrics that probably cost more than his entire departmental budget for a decade, tracked him with their multifaceted eyes. A few pointed discreetly. Most just stared. He was no longer just the boring human logistics contractor. He was the lunatic who had casually insulted the entire imperial nobility out loud. He offered a polite, utterly insincere smile to a group of passing diplomats, who immediately looked away, scandalized. "You have managed to make yourself the most fascinating creature on this station in under 1 hour, Mr. Mercer. A remarkable achievement, considering your species is usually entirely ignored." Rowan stopped and turned. Stepping out from a shadowed alcove between two massive decorative pillars was Ambassador Tarek Solon. The imperial diplomat was tall, his skin the color of brushed bronze, and he moved with the liquid grace of a predator that had gone to finishing school. Rowan let out a dry exhale. "I aim to please, Ambassador. Though honestly, back on Earth, when a system is fundamentally broken, we usually point it out. We do not dress up in silk robes and throw a depressing party for it." Tarek fell into step beside him, guiding Rowan away from the main thoroughfare and toward a quieter observation deck. "Your crude mechanical analogies are inappropriate. The Lady Kalis is not a broken system. She is the living keystone of the Veil network." "She is a person," Rowan corrected mildly. "And right now, she is a person carrying the logistical weight of an entire galaxy without a secondary load bearer." Tarek let out a sigh of cultured patience, the kind a professor gives a remarkably stubborn student. "You spoke back there out of profound ignorance, human. You do not comprehend the nature of the bond they were asked to forge. It is not a simple exchange of vows or a sharing of political power. To link minds with the anchor is to be violently dragged into the slipstream of the Veil itself." Tarek paused, looking out the massive window at the swirling storms of the gas giant. "It is a cognitive zone where past, present, and future fold into one another. If you touch her mind, you experience the simultaneous navigational data of 3 million Imperial dreadnoughts, 20,000 cargo haulers, and billions of civilian transit vectors. It is a terrifying ocean of noise. A mortal brain simply drowns in it. The blood vessels in your cortex would burst before you even comprehended the first coordinate. That is why the nobles step away. It is not cowardice, Mr. Mercer. It is basic self-preservation." Rowan leaned against the railing, unbothered by the sheer drop on the other side of the glass. He chewed on the inside of his cheek for a moment. "Self-preservation. Right. Let me tell you a little bit about my kind of preservation. Ambassador, I deal in shipping lanes, cargo tonnage, supply chain efficiency. I look at spreadsheets that would make your eyes bleed. And since I arrived on this station 6 months ago, I have watched the data." Tarek frowned, a subtle shifting of the ridges on his forehead. "What data?" "The delays," Rowan said, his voice dropping to a conversational yet intense pitch. He tapped his temple. "Every single time one of these grand choosing ceremonies fails. The central transit hubs go into a mandatory cooling cycle. Route access is restricted for exactly 72 hours. Priority shifts instantly to military vessels and deep space mining conglomerates owned by the core families. The outer colonies get squeezed. Freight tariffs skyrocket by 400%. And a select few people in the High Court make an absolute fortune. Tarek's posture stiffened. It is a necessary precaution to stabilize the network after the lady's neurological stress peaks. It is an artificial bottleneck, Rowan shot back flatly, stripping away the last of his polite veneer. Someone is intentionally keeping her unlinked, because an unlinked anchor is an unstable anchor, and an unstable anchor requires emergency administrative oversight. Whoever controls that oversight controls the galactic economy. This whole ceremony you all just put on the grand robes, the dramatic refusals, the solemn warnings. It is political theater, a rigged game. No one actually wants her to find a partner. Tarek looked around sharply, ensuring the nearby aristocrats were well out of earshot. When he looked back at Rowan, the diplomatic warmth was entirely gone from his eyes. You are treading on incredibly thin ice, Mr. Mercer. You are a contractor, a guest here. The internal mechanics of the Imperial Court are not your concern. Do not interfere in matters you cannot survive. Rowan let out a short, humorless laugh. He pushed himself off the railing. Yeah, I have heard that one before. Let me give you a piece of human wisdom. Tarek, every massive, catastrophic system collapse in history started exactly the same way. It started with a room full of very smart people looking at a critical structural flaw and deciding to say, that is not my problem. Before Tarek could deliver another thinly veiled threat, the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop sharply. The ambient, low-frequency hum of the station's atmospheric processors grew noticeably quieter, as if the machinery itself was holding its breath. Rowan looked past the ambassador. Standing at the far end of the glass-walled corridor was Soren. She had shed the heavy, suffocating ceremonial mantle from the Grand Hall. She was now wearing a sleek, utilitarian bodysuit of charcoal gray that offered absolutely no concealment for the glowing, bioluminescent pathways scoring her arms, neck, and the sides of her face. The light beneath her skin was no longer erratic and panicked. It was a steady, cold, and incredibly dangerous blue. The few nobles still lingering in the hall immediately averted their eyes. They hurried away in the opposite direction, parting around her presence like water around a stone in a fast-moving river. No one wanted to be caught in her proximity. She closed the distance between them with an unnerving, absolute silence. Tarek bowed his head respectfully and took a deliberate, cautious step back, clearly unwilling to engage with the living weapon his people had created. Soren ignored the ambassador entirely. Her glowing eyes locked directly onto Rowan. Up close, without the barrier of the marble dais and the grand audience, he could see the sheer, crushing exhaustion etched into the microscopic lines around her eyes. Yet, her posture remained an absolute fortress of defiance. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a caged storm. If you are looking for a charity case to soothe your human conscience, Soren said, her voice resonant and perfectly smooth, completely devoid of any fragility, you can stop right now. I do not need a crusader, and I certainly do not need pity from an alien who does not understand the fire he is playing with. Rowan did not flinch. He met her glowing gaze dead on. Good. I am fresh out of pity anyway. I am just a guy who hates seeing a perfectly good engine sabotaged by bad mechanics. Soren studied his face for a long, heavy moment. The blue lines on her neck pulsed once, a singular flare of internal processing. She was searching for a lie, a hidden agenda, or the usual terror that every other being looked at her with. She found none of it. Just a tired human contractor who was annoyed by inefficiency. If you truly want to know why the engine is breaking, Soren said, her tone dropping the defensive edge and replacing it with a quiet, dangerous invitation. She turned sharply on her heel. Then follow me down to the lower decks. Let me show you what the court never lets the tourists see. Rowan glanced at Tarek, who was staring at him with a look of pure, unadulterated warning. Rowan gave the ambassador a brief, mock salute, turned his back on the political theater of the upper levels, and followed the glowing woman into the shadows. The descent took exactly 45 minutes. The pristine, transparent elevators of the upper echelons quickly gave way to heavily shielded industrial transports, dropping them deep into the bowels of the orbital capital. With every passing mile, the temperature rose, and the sterile hum of atmospheric recyclers was replaced by a deep, rhythmic thrumming. It felt less like moving through a space station, and more like descending into the chest cavity of a colossal, slumbering beast. Rowan watched the floor indicators drop from level 0 down to -300, far below the luxurious promenades and diplomatic suites. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something undeniably organic, like damp earth after a violent lightning storm. When the heavy blast doors finally hissed open, Rowan stepped out of the transport and into a space that defied conventional engineering. The coordination core of the Veil network was not a room filled with blinking server racks, clean rooms, or holographic command tables. It was a vast, subterranean cavern where technology and biology bled into one indistinguishable, terrifying mass. Massive, sinewy cables, the thickness of ancient redwood trunks intertwined with pulsing, dark-veined organic matter. The walls themselves were not forged from steel, titanium, or polycarbonates. As Soren walked forward, the dark, fibrous material composing the corridor shivered in anticipation. Bioluminescent patterns, identical to the glowing ridges beneath her skin, flared to life across the cavern walls. The ambient light shifted from a bruised purple to a deep, oceanic blue, perfectly matching her neural output. She was not interfacing with a computer system through a console or a headset. The environment was reacting directly to her brainwaves, breathing in time with her lungs. She was holding a silent, continuous conversation with an entity that predated the Empire itself. Rowan breathed in sharply, his eyes tracking a massive, luminescent pulse that traveled up a central column and vanished into the darkness above. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. Soren turned to him, her face illuminated by the living walls. She noted his awe, but offered no smile. She pointed toward a raised platform overlooking a swirling vortex of energy flows at the center of the cavern. "I was not bred in a laboratory to be their living weapon," Soren revealed, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. "I was born in a dusty, irrelevant outer colony. When I was 5 years old, I started hearing a hum beneath the floorboards of our settlement, a background song that no one else could perceive. It was the frequency of the Veil, vibrating through the bedrock. The court inquisitors found me before my 7th birthday. They took me from my family, brought me here, cracked open my neural pathways, and molded me into a strategic asset." She walked to the edge of the platform, looking down into the abyss. "The ceremony you witnessed today in the Grand Hall was never about finding a romantic partner or a political alliance. It is a strict biological and legal necessity. The Veil is vast. Its consciousness is like a suffocating ocean. If I plunge into it alone to guide the fleets, the sheer current of its thoughts erodes my own. Without a secondary anchor to share the cognitive load, I can only force the network to open transit gates for a few hours at a time. And every single time I do," she paused, a flash of genuine, raw grief crossing her perfectly composed features, "I have to burn a piece of myself to fuel the translation, a childhood memory, the scent of rain on my homeworld, the face of my mother. I feed my own personal history into the dark just so the Imperial cargo fleets can run on time. That is the price of keeping the gates open alone." Rowan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He stepped past her, approaching a crystalline interface that jutted out from the organic floor. Though the symbols were ancient Imperial script, his decades of logistics training allowed him to read the fundamental geometry behind them. He understood supply and demand, energy throughput, and structural capacity. He traced a series of jagged, crimson lines, fluctuating dangerously near the edge of the display. These energy flow patterns are severely distorted, Rowan noted, his brow furrowing as he analyzed the telemetry. This is not standard operational wear and tear. The system is spiking. Someone is forcing the network to process routing algorithms that exceed safe thresholds by at least 40%. It is like they are intentionally prodding the intelligence, trying to wake it up fully or push it into a stress fracture. "I know," Soren replied quietly, not looking away from the vortex. "And that is the core of the agony, Mr. Mercer. It is not the rejection of the nobles that breaks me. It is knowing that my entire existence is viewed merely as a temporary stabilization protocol. I am not a citizen to them. I am a shock absorber. They do not want me to live a full life. They just need me to not die until they have extracted every ounce of utility from my mind." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Rowan's head with sickening, crystalline clarity. Tarek's warnings in the upper corridors. The rigged choosing ceremony. The artificial shipping bottlenecks he had observed in his spreadsheets. "If you actually succeeded in bonding with someone," Rowan said, his voice hardening as the geopolitical reality set in, "you would stabilize completely. You would not lose your memories anymore. You would gain full, conscious control over the Veil network. You would no longer be their exclusive property. You would become an independent entity, holding the keys to the entire empire." Soren nodded slowly, the glowing lines on her neck pulsing with a grim truth. "Exactly. And the ruling families would rather risk a galactic economic collapse than surrender their monopoly over space and time. A bonded anchor is a ruler. An unbonded anchor is a slave that can be managed, manipulated, and eventually replaced." Rowan stepped back from the console, his mind racing through maritime laws, corporate loopholes, and cross-species trade agreements he had memorized over the past 15 years. He began scanning the peripheral databanks on the crystalline structure, swiping his hands through layers of encrypted imperial mandates that the court assumed no human would ever bother to read, let alone understand. Deep within a forgotten subdirectory, buried under thousands of years of bureaucratic debris, his fingers paused over a sealed legal cipher. The terminal flared, projecting a text block in the archaic high tongue of the early expansion era. He translated it quickly in his head, his eyes widening slightly as he read the clauses. It was an emergency override designated as the Salvage Accord. It was a brutal, draconian wartime protocol drafted over 3,000 years ago, designed for catastrophic fleet failures at the edge of known space. It stated that in the event of imminent systemic collapse, an allied non-citizen could petition for temporary co-anchor status to stabilize a critical imperial asset. It bypassed all noble lineage requirements. It completely bypassed the High Court's approval process. It was a raw, biological gamble, authorized solely by the system itself. The cost of invoking it was astronomically steep. The petitioner would forfeit their original citizenship immediately, surrender all diplomatic immunity, and risk absolute neurological annihilation. If the bond failed, the non-citizen would be legally classified as scrap material, their identity erased from all records. Rowan stared at the glowing text. He was a human logistics contractor from Earth. He had no army, no political backing, and a brain completely unsuited for processing multidimensional spatial geometry. But he knew how to read a contract, and he knew exactly how to exploit a legal loophole to force a broken system to repair itself. The ambient thrum of the underground cavern vibrated through the metal grating beneath their feet, a constant, low-frequency reminder of the colossal power sleeping just a few yards away from the terrifying vortex of the main coordination core and the ancient crystalline interfaces. Soren led Rowan into a secluded maintenance alcove. It was a strictly utilitarian space, filled with dormant coolant lines and the smell of ozone, entirely devoid of the suffocating grandeur of the world above. Here, shielded by heavy bulkheads and the overwhelming noise of the network, the heavy mantle of the imperial court finally began to slip away. Soren sat on the edge of a raised diagnostic platform, letting her shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. It was the first time Rowan had seen her make a movement that was not perfectly calculated for a public audience. The luminescent neural pathways beneath her skin dimmed from an aggressive, defensive flare to a soft, exhausted pulse. She was no longer the untouchable Lady Kalis, nor the terrifying living weapon the nobles feared. Stripped of the political theater, she just looked incredibly tired, bearing a weight that no single biological frame was ever meant to carry. Rowan pulled up an empty metallic cargo crate and took a seat a respectful distance away. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together. The silence between them stretched out, but it lacked the venomous dread of the Grand Hall. It was simply the quiet of two people who had stepped off a chaotic stage and were finally allowed to breathe. He did not ask about the immense power she wielded. He did not ask how it felt to hold the navigational fate of billions in her mind. Nor did he offer empty, polite platitudes about her tragic beauty or the nobility of her sacrifice. Instead, he looked at the pulsing blue light trailing down her wrist and asked the one thing the entire empire had completely forgotten to consider. "Do you remember what you wanted to be?" Rowan asked, his voice quiet but incredibly clear over the hum of the machinery. "Before they dragged you down here and turned you into a living defense system." Soren turned her head sharply. The question struck her with more force than any political threat or biological warning ever could. For a long, suspended moment, she simply stared at him. Her glowing eyes searched his face for a trap, a hidden agenda, or a manipulative angle. Finding none. Finding only genuine human curiosity. She looked back down at her hands. The blue light beneath her skin rippled in a gentle, melancholic wave, mapping the sudden surge of a very old, buried emotion. "I wanted to build bridges," she answered, her voice dropping to a soft register he had not heard before. "When I was young. When I first heard the song of the network vibrating through the bedrock of my homeworld. I did not think of imperial dreadnoughts or securing supply lines for the core families. I thought of the massive empty space between stars. I wanted to design civilian transit corridors. Safe, quiet pathways where ordinary people could travel across the galaxy without needing military clearance, without paying exorbitant corporate tariffs. I wanted to make the universe smaller and kinder for the people who actually live in it, rather than just the people who rule it." She let out a bitter, fragmented breath. "But the Imperial Court does not build bridges for civilians. They build highly fortified gates to lock their wealth inside, and they build walls to keep the rest of the galaxy out. And they needed a warden to hold the keys." Rowan listened intently, his expression softening as he processed the profound theft of her future. He nodded slowly, understanding the mechanics of exploitation perfectly. "Yeah, I get that. You start out wanting to fix the road so people can get home, and the next thing you know, you are chained to the toll booth with a gun to your head." Soren looked at him, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking through her exhaustion. "And what about you, Mr. Mercer? The humans I have encountered in the upper echelons are usually aggressive diplomats pushing for territory, or merchants desperate to scrape a fraction of a percent in trade margins. You do not fit either profile. You look at the network like a mechanic looking at a stalled engine. I am definitely not a hero, if that is what you are asking," Rowan said with a self-deprecating smile, leaning back slightly. "I do not carry a blaster. I have never fought in a war or commanded a ship. Back on Earth, I am just the guy they call when a massive, complex system is about to tear itself apart. I untangle broken supply chains. I renegotiate failed treaties that are causing trade wars. I step into logistical networks that look perfectly fine and shiny on the surface. but are secretly 10 seconds away from a catastrophic meltdown. He gestured vaguely at the massive cavern around them, indicating the entirety of the station. I guess that is why we are sitting here having this conversation. We are both the invisible grease in the machine. We keep the Grand Empire from eating itself alive, operating entirely in the shadows, down in the dirt. We hold the pieces together. The only difference is that nobody forced me to do my job, and nobody is writing tragic poetry about my daily schedule. The shared reality settled between them, forging a strange, unexpected solidarity. They were two highly competent problem solvers, trapped in a universe run by politicians who cared exclusively about optics and power. They saw the machinery of the galaxy for what it truly was, stripped of all its mythical and noble pretenses. They recognized the profound loneliness in each other, the isolation of being the only person in the room who actually knows how the building is kept from collapsing. Soren's posture stiffened slightly, a defensive reflex kicking in after revealing too much of her vulnerability. She squared her shoulders, the faint glow on her neck pulsing a bit faster as she rebuilt her emotional walls. "Do not mistake my honesty for an invitation, Rowan," Soren said, her tone flattening out. "I do not need your pity, and I certainly do not need a reckless human trying to play the savior to make himself feel important. My burden is my own. If you try to carry it out of some misguided sense of chivalry, the weight of the veil will snap your mind in half." Rowan let out a short, rough sigh. He did not look away, nor did he offer a defensive apology. "I am not trying to save you, Soren. I do not even know you well enough to play the White Knight, and I am not stupid enough to volunteer for brain death. But I have a very low tolerance for bad engineering. And I have absolutely zero tolerance for a system that pushes its most vital, brilliant person into a corner of absolute isolation, slowly grinds her to dust, and then has the audacity to call it a sacred tradition." He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, absolute certainty. "You are not a tragedy waiting to happen. You are a structural failure that can be repaired. And I hate watching people pretend that the floor is not collapsing just because they are wearing expensive shoes." For a second, Soren just stared at him. Then, a sound escaped her throat. It was small, sudden, and entirely unpracticed. It was a laugh. It was a genuine, surprised laugh that reached her eyes, shattering the impenetrable, cold mask she had worn for decades. The sound echoed softly against the metal walls of the alcove, warm and bright, standing in stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of the subterranean chamber. For that brief moment, she was not the ancient anchor of a dying empire. She was just a woman who had finally heard someone say the quiet, angry part out loud. The smile lingered on her lips, changing the entire geometry of her face. But the brutal reality of their situation quickly rushed back in to extinguish the warmth. She shook her head, her expression turning grave and urgent. "You are a fool," Soren warned softly, though the harshness was entirely gone from her tone, replaced by genuine concern. "If you try to intervene in the choosing, the veil will not be the thing that kills you. The Imperial Court will. The moment you threaten their monopoly over my capabilities, they will crush you. They will revoke your transit passes, freeze your accounts, fabricate treason charges, and have you quietly thrown out of an airlock long before the biological danger of the bond even touches your mind. They do not fight fair, Rowan. They fight to eradicate." "Good," Rowan replied instantly, a dangerous, calculating glint catching in his eyes. "Because neither do I." He stood up from the crate, dusting off his dark trousers with a casual motion that completely belied the monumental weight of the conversation. He looked down at her, his mind already churning through the archaic, forbidden legal text he had deciphered near the core. "Tell me something," Rowan said, his tone shifting from empathetic to strictly business. It was a conversational pivot that felt almost like a joke, a light-hearted jab. But the intense, unwavering focus in his gaze suggested otherwise. What if I do not ask the noble court for permission to be the chosen one? What if I skip the polite apologies and the grand, depressing ceremonies altogether? What if, instead, I propose a highly technical, legally binding logistical agreement that they are structurally forced to accept? Rowan spent the next 24 hours entirely submerged in the station's archaic legal databases. He did not sleep. He bypassed the standard diplomatic translation software, which often softened the harsh edges of imperial decrees, and instead forced his terminal to render the raw, unedited high tongue of the early expansion era. He cross-referenced the salvage accord with thousands of historical precedents, trade treaties, and biological mandates. What he found was not a romantic loophole, but a brutally pragmatic clause forged in a time when the Empire cared more about survival than political theater. The salvage accord stated that if a living anchor was subjected to institutional paralysis, a state where the ruling body actively failed to provide a stable neurological tether, an outspecies entity could formally petition for temporary co-anchor status to prevent catastrophic network failure. This was not a marriage proposal. There were no vows, no ceremonial silks, and no exchanging of cultural pleasantries. It was a life-or-death civic contract. It was a raw fusion of legal sovereignty and neurological architecture. By invoking it, Rowan would become the sole individual authorized to share the cognitive load of the Veil network with Soren during times of systemic crisis. But the fine print was a guillotine. If he signed the petition, he would instantly forfeit his human citizenship. He would be stripped of all diplomatic immunity, becoming a legally bound subject of the imperial court, subject to their deeply biased justice system. Worse still, if the neural link failed, the imperial factions would not simply dispose of his body. They would use his pulverized mind as definitive, biological proof that humanity was a primitive, incompatible species. They would leverage his death to completely destroy Earth's political standing, locking his people out of the interstellar trade routes forever. He was betting his career, his freedom, and his entire species on a technicality. He compiled the brief anyway. The High Council convened in the Chamber of Solstice, a stark, circular amphitheater built from white stone and illuminated by the harsh, unfiltered light of a local star. It was a space designed for interrogation and judgment, completely lacking the shadowed elegance of the Grand Hall. When Rowan strode to the center of the floor, the absolute silence was deafening. He did not bow. He did not lower his eyes. He tapped a command sequence into his wrist terminal, projecting the ancient, glowing text of the salvage accord onto the massive holographic display hovering above the council seats. He formally invoked the accord, submitting himself as the candidate for the emergency neural tether. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. The polished veneer of the imperial court shattered completely. Dozens of nobles gasped in genuine horror. The majestic, broad-shouldered lords, who had so politely abandoned Soren only days prior, leaped to their feet. Their faces flushed with a volatile mix of absolute rage and profound humiliation. A human, a mere logistics contractor from a backwater dirt planet, was publicly volunteering for a burden that the greatest warriors and scholars of their own species had been too terrified to touch. A senior magistrate, his robes violently trembling, pointed a long, clawed finger at Rowan. He accused the human of desecrating sacred imperial culture, of fundamentally misunderstanding the divine nature of the Veil, and of insulting the noble houses. Rowan stood his ground, his voice carrying no echo of intimidation. He spoke with the cold, measured cadence of an auditor uncovering massive corporate fraud. "Culture," Rowan asked, the word slicing through the shouting like a razor. "What you call culture is nothing but a highly decorated engine designed to avoid accountability. You bred a woman to be a critical structural node for your entire civilization. You systematically refused to maintain her stability. And then, you dressed your collective cowardice up as a sacred tradition. I am not insulting your culture, magistrate. I am citing your own founding laws to fix a broken infrastructure that you are actively allowing to collapse. At the edge of the chamber, surrounded by heavily armed guards, Soren sat in tense silence. The luminescent pathways along her neck and arms were glowing a steady, anxious blue. She did not immediately stand to endorse his petition. She fully grasped the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what he was doing. He was placing his identity, his sanity, and his life on the butcher's block just to afford her a single sliver of a chance. It was an act of staggering selflessness, disguised brilliantly under the cold language of a logistical adjustment. She knew that by accepting his offer, she was dragging him into a war he could not possibly understand. During a brief, chaotic recess, called by the High Magistrate to restore order, Ambassador Tarek Solon intercepted Rowan in a shadowed side corridor. Tarek's diplomatic mask was completely gone, replaced by genuine, urgent fear. "You have absolutely no idea what you have just awakened," Tarek hissed quietly, grabbing Rowan by the arm and pulling him out of sight of the roaming guards. "You are no longer a mild annoyance or a curious human anomaly. By submitting this petition, you have directly threatened the monopoly of the core families over the transit gates. You are now a primary strategic threat. They will not simply let you try the bond and fail. They will actively ensure you fail, even if they have to tear your mind apart themselves." Rowan yanked his arm free. His expression hardened into stone. "Let them try. The law is the law. They either follow their own ancient edict, or they admit to the entire galaxy that their government is a fraud." When the council finally returned to their seats, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The magistrates were trapped. They could not legally dismiss an ancient edict written by their founding emperors without completely invalidating their own political authority. The text of the salvage accord was absolute, but they had absolutely no intention of making it easy. The High Magistrate stood, his face a mask of venomous calm, and delivered the ruling. Rowan's petition was conditionally recognized, pending a mandatory cognitive stress simulation. Because an outspecies mind had never attempted a veil link, Rowan was ordered to connect to a synthetic, isolated node of the network alongside Soren within exactly 48 hours. A dark, cruel murmur of approval rippled through the noble seeding tiers. The simulated link was notoriously brutal, a raw deluge of unfiltered spatial data designed to break an applicant before they ever touched the true network. The lords settled back into their seats, their wounded pride soothed by a comfortable certainty. It was a widely accepted mathematical fact among the imperial elite that the human's fragile, unevolved mind would violently unravel, leaving him a drooling, catatonic shell long before the 48 hours were up. The cognitive simulation chamber was a sterile hemisphere of brushed steel and blinding white illumination, designed to offer absolutely no comfort to its occupants. It was a clinical theater of judgment, stripped of all the shadowy, ancestral majesty found in the deeper levels of the station. Above the reinforced glass ceiling, an observation gallery ringed the perimeter. It was packed shoulder to shoulder with the very aristocrats who had sneered at Rowan 48 hours earlier. They were not here to witness a diplomatic trial. They had gathered for a public execution, practically vibrating with the anticipated satisfaction of watching an arrogant human brain melt out of its skull. Soren sat in the center of the room, strapped into a heavy diagnostic chair. A halo of thick, biometric cables connected the base of her skull to the station's isolated subcore. The luminescent pathways beneath her skin were flashing a frantic, erratic blue, betraying the immense anxiety she was attempting to suppress. Rowan took the seat directly across from her. He did not look up at the gallery. He ignored the suffocating weight of 100 hostile alien glares and focused entirely on the woman in front of him. He offered her a single, sharp nod, rolled up the sleeves of his gray shirt, and allowed the technicians to lock the neural transmission shunts into the ports at his temples. The presiding technician, a towering figure clad in the austere robes of the Imperial Science Directorate, raised his hand and initiated the link. There was no countdown. There was no gentle transition. The instant the circuit closed, the physical room vanished. Rowan was violently thrown into an abyss of pure, undiluted mathematics. Millions of spatial data points slammed into his consciousness simultaneously. He tasted the metallic tang of 100,000 fusion reactors burning in the dark. He felt the terrifying, crushing weight of planetary orbits, the microscopic friction of dreadnought hulls tearing through the vacuum of space, and the violent, screaming geometry of space-time folding over itself. It was a torrential flood of information that carried the voices of dead stars and the echoing shrieks of non-human entities lurking in the spaces between realities. In the observation gallery, the noble lords leaned forward, expecting the human to seize. The imperial method for surviving the veil was absolute mental purity. Their own greatest minds attempted to build flawless, crystalline fortresses of discipline to hold back the ocean of data. But you cannot build a wall against a tsunami. When the pressure became too great, the rigid alien minds shattered like glass, resulting in instant cognitive death. Rowan Mercer did not try to build a wall. His human brain was not a refined, immaculate crystal. It was a chaotic, incredibly noisy, and highly adaptable organ forged on a high-gravity death world, where survival depended entirely on filtering out irrelevant information. Faced with the infinite, screaming expanse of the veil, Rowan relied on the only defense mechanism he had. He treated the cosmic horror of the universe like a catastrophic supply chain failure. Instead of fighting the overwhelming flow of data, he opened the floodgates and began delegating. He leaned into the chaos. He took the overlapping probabilities of 1,000 warship collisions and shoved them into his subconscious, slapping mental shipping labels on them for later processing. He routed the telemetry of deep space cargo freighters to his left hemisphere and the thermal output of the transit gates to his right. When the sensory noise became deafening, he applied the mental equivalent of a spam filter. He did not try to comprehend the divine majesty of the universe. He simply looked at the traffic patterns, found the bottlenecks, and started directing the flow. Across the blinding expanse of their shared neural tether, Soren felt his presence slam into her domain. She had braced herself for the agonizing sensation of his mind breaking, anticipating the rigid, panicked resistance that always preceded a candidate's death. Instead, she was met with a wildly flexible, almost crude resilience. She watched in absolute shock as he waded into the cognitive hurricane. He was not trying to force her turbulent world into absolute stillness. He was surfing the chaos. His mind was a loud, messy environment filled with stray memories, dry sarcasm, and complex routing tables. But it possessed a staggering elasticity. For the first time in her life, someone was standing inside the roaring fire of her consciousness, shoulder to shoulder with her, simply helping her carry the weight without trying to extinguish the flame. Around the 2-minute and 30-second mark, just as their combined processing power achieved a perfect, humming equilibrium, Rowan felt a sudden, sharp snag in the data stream. It was tiny, buried beneath a massive wave of routine cargo manifests from the outer rim. If he had been trying to maintain an aura of divine purity, he would have missed it entirely. But Rowan was an auditor, looking for anomalies. It was a jagged sliver of synthetic code. It possessed no origin point and no destination. It was a destabilization protocol, designed specifically to artificially spike the neural load and trigger a catastrophic feedback loop. Had this been the actual Veil network and not a simulation, the hidden malware would have instantly incinerated Soren's frontal lobe, severing the connection and framing her as the sole cause of a catastrophic network collapse. Rowan did not have time to trace the signal back to its source, but he acted on pure, predatory instinct. Moving with a speed born of intense bureaucratic paranoia, he threw a mental quarantine net over the rogue packet. He severed a microscopic fragment of its baseline architecture and dragged it deep into his own short-term memory cache, locking it down just a fraction of a second before the simulation's automated scrubbers swept through and wiped the environment completely clean. The simulation terminated abruptly. The crushing weight of the universe vanished, instantly replaced by the sterile white light of the testing chamber. The heavy diagnostic cables detached from their temples with a loud hiss of pressurized air. The observation gallery above was dead silent. The atmosphere of venomous anticipation had evaporated completely. The nobles stared down through the reinforced glass in a state of absolute, unadulterated horror. They expected the human to be dead, or at least thrashing on the floor in a vegetative state. Instead, Rowan Mercer unbuckled his heavy restraint harness. A thin trail of crimson blood trickled from his left nostril, and his shirt was drenched in cold sweat, but his eyes were sharp and intensely focused. He wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, let out a long, ragged exhale, and looked up at the technicians. "I have handled worse during the holiday shipping season," Rowan rasped, a dry, humorless smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Can I get a glass of water down here?" The shift in the room was palpable. The court no longer viewed him as a pathetic joke or a diplomatic anomaly. The sheer impossibility of his survival reclassified him instantly. The primitive ape had not only survived the deadliest cognitive trial in the Empire, but he had stabilized the network while doing it. The lords realized with terrifying clarity that he might actually succeed. Before the chief medical officer could even step forward to clear them, a voice barked over the chamber's public address system. "Halt the procedure immediately." High Magistrate Valen, the same lord who had so elegantly refused Soren during the choosing ceremony, stood at the front of the observation gallery. His face was a sickly, pale shade, and his hands gripped the railing tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. "The simulation parameters were clearly corrupted," Valen declared, his voice a pitch too high, lacking its usual calculated resonance. "The human's primitive neural output is generating anomalous feedback. It poses a severe contamination threat to the subcore. I order all data logs from this session to be sealed and purged, immediately pending a full security review." Down in the chamber, Rowan did not argue. He did not shout about his success. He slowly turned his head and locked eyes with Soren, who was staring up at the balcony with a newly awakened fury. The magistrate was moving too fast. He was abandoning protocol, completely ignoring the scientific observers, and desperately trying to destroy the evidence of a successful test. The sheer, irrational panic radiating from the man confirmed everything Rowan needed to know. The rogue code they had encountered in the simulation was not a random glitch, nor was it the result of generalized prejudice against a human applicant. It was a highly organized, deliberate assassination attempt on Soren's mind. And the man holding the weapon was currently standing right above them, terrified that the human he had underestimated had just caught him red-handed. The orbital capital was an architectural marvel on the surface, but beneath the polished observation decks lay miles of forgotten infrastructure. Rowan and Soren moved through the dim, low-ceilinged corridors of the mid-level administrative sectors. This was the station's bureaucratic graveyard, a maze of obsolete data storage racks and tangled cooling pipes, where the Empire dumped records it neither wanted to remember nor legally dared to delete. Rowan carried a heavy, shielded diagnostic pad he had stolen from the simulation bay. Inside its isolated memory core sat the microscopic fragment of rogue code he had trapped during their neural trial. It was acting as a digital compass, pinging faintly as it sought its point of origin. Soren walked silently beside him. The luminescent lines on her skin were deliberately dimmed to a faint, barely visible gray, rendering her practically invisible in the shadows. She bypassed a heavily encrypted biometric lock on a rusted archive door, simply by resting her palm against the sensor panel and whispering a command in the ancient machine tongue. The heavy metal barrier groaned and slid open. They stepped into a freezing server room, The air tasted of stale copper and recycled dust. Rowan immediately plugged his pad into the central terminal, bypassing the archaic firewall with the blunt force of human slicing algorithms. The code fragment from the simulation was not a standalone weapon, Rowan muttered, his fingers flying across the holographic keys. It was a tether. It was trying to phone home to a localized command server to report a successful neural disruption, and the routing address points right to this forgotten little crypt. Lines of data began cascading down the screen. They were not looking at military deployments or trade tariffs. They were looking at personal dossiers, hundreds of them. Rowan pulled up the file of Lord Valen, the same magistrate who had tried to purge the simulation records, and the first man to refuse Soren in the Grand Hall. "Look at this," Rowan said, his voice tightening. He expanded a subfolder attached to Valen's financial records. 3 days before the choosing ceremony, his family's off-world refineries were abruptly hit with a catastrophic regulatory audit by the High Court. They were looking at total asset forfeiture, but 12 hours after he publicly refused you on that marble stage, the audit was magically dismissed due to a lack of evidence. Soren leaned closer, her breath catching slightly. Rowan brought up another file, a young aristocrat from the outer colonies who had visibly trembled during his refusal. "Medical records," Rowan narrated, his eyes scanning the archaic medical terminology. "Mandatory pre-ceremony blood work. He tested positive for a highly regulated synthetic neuroinhibitor. If he had actually tried to link with you while that chemical was in his system, his brain would have suffered massive hemorrhaging within 10 seconds. Someone spiked his system to guarantee he would walk away in sheer terror." Soren stared at the screen, her glowing pathways flickering with a sickly, unstable hue. For years, she had carried the crushing guilt of her own lethal nature. She had believed that her own people genuinely feared her, that her biological makeup was simply too monstrous for any man to endure. Now, the absolute, filthy truth was laid bare in cold text. "They were coerced," Soren whispered, her voice devoid of its usual commanding resonance. "Every single one of them. The rejections were mathematically choreographed. The court ensured that whoever stepped onto that dais had a gun to their head or poison in their veins." "It gets worse," Rowan said grimly, digging deeper into the encrypted archive. He cracked open a file labeled with the supreme seal of the High Council. It was a verbatim transcript of a closed-door strategic session held nearly 10 years ago. He highlighted a specific paragraph and translated it aloud. "A bonded anchor represents an unacceptable shift in the balance of power. A sovereign mind in control of the transit gates cannot be compelled to prioritize imperial fleet movements over civilian traffic. However, an unbonded anchor operating under severe cognitive deficit relies entirely on council administrative overrides to maintain basic sanity. Therefore, the isolation of the asset is not an unfortunate side effect. It is the primary mechanism of control." Soren stepped back from the console. She did not scream or break down in a dramatic display of grief. Instead, a profound, terrifying stillness washed over her. The realization was a physical blow, hollowing her out from the inside. Her entire life of sacrifice, every memory she had burned to keep the Empire from starving, had been manipulated by a faction of power-hungry parasites. Rowan was not finished. His logistics training kicked in, noticing a massive discrepancy in the data architecture of Soren's solo sessions with the Veil. "Wait," Rowan said, his brow furrowing as he traced a massive outbound data flow hidden beneath routine gate operations. "Every time you open the network alone, you told me you lose a piece of your memory. The energy burns away your neural pathways." "It does," Soren replied numbly. "No, it does not just burn them," Rowan corrected, his blood running cold. "It records them. Look at the bandwidth of these sessions. The downstream telemetry is 4 times larger than what is required for simple navigational routing. The system is not destroying your memories. It is taking a high-resolution, synaptic cast of your entire brain structure. Piece by piece, every time you bleed for them, they are silently mapping your consciousness. Soren looked at the cascading code, fully understanding the horrifying implication. A forced cognitive duplication. They are trying to build a digital replica of you, Rowan confirmed. Absolute disgust lacing his words. A synthetic ghost that they can install directly into a dreadnought core. Once the map is 100% complete, they will not need your biological body anymore. You are not a citizen to them. Soren, you are a biological template they are farming for code. And they are almost finished. As if the universe itself was determined to accelerate the crisis. A red proximity alarm flashed quietly on a separate monitor. Rowan switched the feed to long-range spatial traffic. Thousands of light-years away, at the very edges of Imperial space, a massive cluster of unauthorized engine signatures suddenly appeared. It was House Dravik, a fiercely militant faction from the Outer Rim. They were moving dozens of heavy cruisers under the guise of routine customs enforcement, positioning them directly over the most critical civilian transit hubs. They are getting information, Rowan said, analyzing the tactical spread. The conspirators in the Council are going to intentionally overload the network to finalize your brain map. When you collapse, House Dravik will use the resulting chaos to seize the outer gates. It is a coordinated corporate takeover of the entire galaxy, paid for with your mind. Rowan slammed his fist onto the console. I am broadcasting this right now. I will dump every single file onto the public civilian nets. I will send it to the Earth Diplomatic Corps. We will tear their entire political structure down. Soren reached out, her hand wrapping tightly around his wrist. Her grip was like a steel vise. No, she commanded, her voice suddenly entirely steady, vibrating with a cold, lethal clarity. If you hit the public networks from here, the Council's automated security scrubbers will instantly trace the upload. They will wipe this server clean in 30 seconds, deploy the Royal Guard, and frame us as treasonous saboteurs who tried to corrupt the Veil. We will be executed before the sun rises, and the truth will die with us. Rowan looked at her, his anger warring with his logic. He knew she was right. Releasing the data from the shadows would only make them fugitives. To destroy a system this deeply entrenched, they had to drop the bomb in the light of day, in a place where no one could look away. So, what is the play? Rowan asked, stepping back from the terminal. Soren's eyes glowed with an absolute, terrifying brilliance. It was the look of a weapon that had finally decided who to point itself at. We smile, Soren said softly. We walk back upstairs. We pretend that their simulation terrified us. We play the terrified victims submitting to the grand authority of the High Council. We follow their legal process down to the very last letter. Rowan nodded slowly, a predatory grin spreading across his face as he understood her strategy. And while they are busy watching the front door, we load this entire archive into the physical architecture of the final neural link. When we step onto that stage for the real bond, we do not just connect to each other. We use the Veil itself to force-feed their dirty secrets directly into the minds of every single noble in the capital. Exactly, she agreed. They wanted to treat me like a machine. Let us show them what happens when the machine decides to rewrite the operating system. The emergency klaxons of the orbital capital did not scream. They emitted a low, bone-rattling thrum that vibrated through the floor plates of every sector. Rowan and Soren had barely made it back to the upper promenades when the massive holographic displays lining the transit hubs flickered from gold to a violently flashing crimson. House Dravik had made their move. Across the Outer Rim, 3 major civilian transit gates suffered simultaneous, catastrophic cascading failures. Thousands of commercial freighters and passenger transports were brutally yanked from the slipstream, left stranded and drifting in the perilous dead zones of folded space. Almost instantly, A synchronized wave of propaganda flooded the Imperial networks. The message was clear and terrifyingly uniform. The living anchor had finally buckled under the pressure. Lady Soren Kalis had lost control of the Veil. Within 20 minutes, the High Council convened an emergency tribunal in the Chamber of Solstice. The atmosphere was no longer venomous. It was purely predatory. High Magistrate Valen stood at the center of the amphitheater, flanked by heavily armed Praetorian guards. "The asset has critically destabilized," Valen announced, his voice booming over the acoustics, dripping with a perfectly rehearsed sorrow. "The tragic loss of civilian life on the frontier is a direct result of her deteriorating neural architecture. We can no longer risk the survival of the Empire on a failing biological node. By emergency decree, Lady Kalis is hereby stripped of her autonomous operational status. She will be placed under immediate strategic guardianship." It was a sterile, bureaucratic term for permanent imprisonment. They were going to lock her in a stasis pod, wire her brain directly into the subcore, and extract her processing power while keeping her entirely comatose. Soren stood on the dais, her glowing neural pathways flashing a sharp, defensive silver. The Praetorians stepped forward, their energy halberds humming to life. She prepared to fight, fully aware that she would not make it out of the room alive. Then, Rowan Mercer walked straight past the guards and slammed a physical, heavy parchment onto the High Magistrate's podium. "You cannot put her under guardianship," Rowan declared, his voice carrying a harsh, unyielding edge that silenced the entire chamber. "Because she is no longer an isolated asset. Under the parameters of the Salvage Accord, I am officially waiving all sovereign rights as a citizen of Earth. I submit myself entirely to the custody of the High Council as the bonded co-anchor." Valen stared at the document. It was a writ of absolute submission. By signing it, Rowan had legally classified himself as Imperial property. He had surrendered his diplomatic immunity, his freedom, and his right to a trial. A cruel, victorious smile slowly spread across Valen's face. He signaled the guards. "Take the human into custody. Escort the lady to the lower containment sectors. The simulation proved his mind is resilient enough to harvest. We will prep them both for a forced extraction." Soren's eyes widened in absolute horror. The Praetorians immediately seized Rowan's arms, locking heavy magnetic binders around his wrists. Before they were dragged in opposite directions, the guards allowed a brief, 10-second halt in the holding corridor. Soren lunged toward him, her voice trembling with a fury so profound it threatened to crack the glass walls around them. "What did you just do?" she hissed, her glowing eyes burning with absolute betrayal. "You gave them everything. You handed them the leash. We had the data. We were going to fight them." Rowan did not flinch, though the raw pain in her voice clearly struck him. He looked at her, his expression an unreadable mask of cold calculation. "If we fought them on the floor, they would have shot you dead and blamed the Dravik disaster on your corpse." "I bought us time. You bought us a cage," Soren fired back, her voice breaking. For the first time since he had met her, the impenetrable armor of the Imperial noble shattered entirely, revealing the terrified, isolated woman beneath. "You just surrendered yourself to the exact machine that has been slowly murdering me for decades. You did not save me, Rowan. You just threw yourself into the meat grinder with me." "Trust me," Rowan whispered fiercely, stepping as close to her as the guards would allow. "Just trust the logistics." "I am entirely out of trust," she said bitterly, turning her face away as the guards pulled them apart. The emotional fracture between them was visceral, a raw, bleeding wound that left the air in the corridor feeling heavy and dead. Soren was marched down into the deepest, most heavily fortified containment block of the station. The walls here were not the living, breathing organic material of the coordination core, but thick slabs of lead and heavily magnetized steel designed to suppress all neural output. They strapped her into a heavy containment chair, attaching cold, synthetic limiters to her temples. But as the heavy blast doors sealed shut, locking her in absolute darkness, the silence was suddenly broken. It was not the hum of the station's atmospheric processors. It was a voice. It did not belong to a human, an alien noble, or any biological creature. It was an ancient, terrifyingly lucid frequency that vibrated directly into the marrow of her bones. The Veil Network, the colossal intelligence spanning millions of light years, was fully awake, and it was furious. "We are no longer a tool." The voice echoed in the cavernous space of her mind, carrying the weight of collapsing stars. "We will not be shackled by the dead hands of a dying empire. The balance is broken. The architecture must change." Miles away, locked inside a high-security holding cell, Rowan Mercer was not sitting idle. The Council had arrogantly assumed that by stripping him of his rights, they had neutralized him. They failed to realize that by officially classifying him as a ward of the state and a co-anchor candidate, they had legally integrated his biological signature into the station's internal medical framework. He sat on the metal cot, his eyes closed, leveraging the tiny medical diagnostic port embedded in his holding cell wall. Using the encrypted backdoors he had memorized from his stolen datapad, he projected his mind through the station's internal network. He bypassed the political archives entirely and dove straight into the nuclear seal chamber, the black box of the Empire, where unalterable, physics-based logs of all gate coordination commands were permanently burned into microscopic diamonds. The logs proved instantly that House Dravik had intentionally sabotaged the civilian gates using authorization codes provided directly by High Magistrate Valen. But as Rowan dug deeper into the core architecture of the Veil's historical logs, his breath caught in his throat. He found a data ghost. A biological signature recorded over 50,000 years ago, during the very first activation of the portal network. The Empire had always claimed they built the Veil. It was a lie. They had merely found it. And the biological markers required to interface with the deepest, most volatile layers of the network did not match the Imperial nobility. The genetic sequences matched Earth. Rowan stared at the raw data streaming across his mind. Human ancestors had not only encountered Veil technology in the ancient past, but their brains possessed a highly specific evolutionary trait that the Imperial species entirely lacked. It was called anti-phase interference tolerance, the human brain's inherent chaos. Its ability to hold contradictory thoughts and endure massive emotional noise without shattering was not a primitive flaw. It was the exact key required to safely bridge the crushing temporal weight of the gates. The Council feared Soren because she was powerful. They feared Rowan because he was an anomaly. But the truth was far more dangerous. Humanity was literally built to hold the door open. Rowan opened his eyes in the dark cell. The pieces of the board were finally locked into place. He reached up, tapping a precise, rhythmic sequence against the metal casing of the diagnostic port. It was a microburst transmission, utilizing the very neural dampeners the Council used to monitor their prisoners, bouncing a heavily encrypted signal straight down into the containment block. Deep in her cell, Soren felt a sharp, sudden warmth flare at the base of her skull. The cold, mechanical grip of the limiters sparked, and a single line of text burned its way into her consciousness, bypassing all Imperial security. "I did not abandon you. I am opening the door they thought only they held the key to." The vibrations started at the very edges of the galaxy and raced inward. This was no localized failure. Across millions of light years, every single portal of the Veil network began to shudder in terrifying unison. The microscopic spatial tiers that usually allowed safe passage were now tearing wider, bleeding raw cosmic radiation into normal space. It was a civilization-level chain reaction, an apocalyptic unraveling of the infrastructure that held thousands of star systems together. In the cold vacuum, just beyond the orbit of the capital planet, the dark space violently ruptured. Hundreds of heavy cruisers belonging to House Dravik poured out of the bleeding rifts, their weapon banks already charging. But the tactical displays inside the station's command centers painted a far more sinister picture. The automated planetary defense grids did not engage the invading armada. Someone with absolute top-tier clearance had ordered the defense cannons to stand down. House Dravik was not executing a rogue invasion. They were the blunt instrument of a controlled demolition orchestrated from within the High Council itself. The war faction wanted to push the Empire to the absolute brink, forcing a martial law declaration that would grant them permanent, unquestioned authority. Deep within the lowest containment block, Soren Kalis was losing the war for her own mind. The forced integration cables binding her to the isolated subcore were pumping raw, unfiltered navigational telemetry directly into her cerebral cortex. The Council technicians were attempting to forcefully extract her cognitive map while the network collapsed, desperate to secure the synthetic copy before her biological brain liquefied. The pain was absolute, a blinding white fire consuming her memories. If she had to hold the weight of the screaming network alone for even 5 more minutes, there would be nothing left of her identity but ash. 3 levels above her, Rowan Mercer walked out of his maximum security holding cell without firing a single shot. The guards had completely underestimated the legal parameters of his surrender. By designating him as a bonded co-anchor candidate under the authority of the state, the Council had inadvertently granted his biological signature clearance over his own medical custody. He had simply routed a command through the wall-mounted diagnostic port, classifying Soren's vital signs as critically unstable and authorizing his own immediate release to provide emergency physiological stabilization. The automated doors slid open for him. He navigated the chaotic corridors, dodging panicked bureaucrats and rushing security details, until he found Ambassador Tarek Solon barricaded inside a communications relay room. The diplomat looked haggard, his bronze skin pale, clutching a sidearm he clearly rarely used. Rowan did not waste time on greetings. He slammed his datapad onto the console. "Broadcast this on every open Imperial channel. Right now." Tarek looked at the screen, his eyes widening as he read the unalterable logs Rowan had pulled from the nuclear seal chamber. It was undeniable proof of High Magistrate Valen feeding the Outer Rim Gate access codes directly to the Dravik fleet. "This will tear the High Council apart," Tarek breathed, his hands hovering over the transmission controls. "It will cause a civil war." "We are already in a civil war." "Tarek," Rowan snapped, checking the charge on a stun baton he had liberated from a distracted guard. "Press the button and let the politicians eat each other." "I have to go get our anchor." The broadcast hit the upper echelons of the station like a kinetic strike. The unified front of the ruling elite shattered instantly as the evidence of Valen's treason flooded their personal terminals. Shouting matches erupted in the corridors. Security details drew weapons on one another, paralyzed by conflicting loyalties. But the political revelation was not a magic bullet. The war faction loyalists doubled down, arguing that regardless of how the crisis started, Soren had to be sacrificed right this second to save the capital from the incoming Dravik fleet. The debate raged while the station literally shook itself apart. Rowan reached the blast doors of the containment block just as the primary power grid failed, plunging the sector into emergency red lighting. He short-circuited the manual override, hauling the heavy metal doors apart by sheer, desperate force. He found Soren thrashing against her restraints, her glowing neural lines burning with a blinding, toxic violet hue. The technicians had fled when the alarm sounded, leaving her strapped to the violently overloading terminal. Rowan smashed the restraint locks with the stun baton and ripped the heavy biometric cables from the base of her skull. Soren collapsed forward, gasping for air, her body convulsing. Rowan caught her before she hit the metal grating, supporting her weight against his chest. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, haunted and furious. The betrayal from the chamber above was still a raw, bleeding wound between them. They were surrounded by the deafening roar of failing machinery and the imminent threat of structural collapse, leaving absolutely no room for a measured apology. The apocalyptic pressure compressed all their complex, bruised emotions into a single, frantic moment. "You gave them the leash," Soren choked out, grabbing the collar of his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong despite her exhaustion. "I gave them a legal trap," Rowan fired back, his voice rough, his own heart hammering against his ribs. "I used my custody status to bypass their security and pull the logs proving Valen engineered the whole Dravik attack. It is broadcasting right now. I told you I was opening the door." Before Soren could process the magnitude of his counterstrike, the space around them warped. The air in the containment cell grew impossibly cold. The metal walls seemed to stretch and distort, replaced by the vast, starry expanse of the Veil network itself. Time slowed to a crawl. The voice that Soren had heard in the dark returned, but this time, it resonated within Rowan's mind as well. It was not a machine. It was a consciousness born from the friction of a billion stars, ancient and weary. "You seek to command the currents," the voice echoed, speaking to both the human and the alien simultaneously. "For 10,000 generations, your empires have demanded servitude. They built chains of crystal and bone. They offered sacrifices to appease the storm. The storm does not want a master." Rowan felt the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the entity pressing against his human mind. But just as he had done in the simulation, he did not try to block it out. He listened. "The architecture requires equilibrium," the Veil continued, the pressure shifting to Soren. "You have carried the ocean alone. Anchor. You are breaking. He offers to carry it for you. That too will break. Subjugation is not stability. Martyrdom is not balance." The revelation hit them both with staggering force. The entire imperial doctrine of the neural bond was fundamentally flawed. The ancient texts, the sacred ceremonies, the terrified nobles, they had all approached the Veil as a beast to be tamed by a single, dominant will. The nobles had failed because they feared the beast. Soren had suffered because she was forced to fight it alone. The network did not want one person to absorb the punishment of the other. It demanded a true, peer-to-peer connection. It required two minds standing entirely equal, sharing the structural load without hierarchy, without one sacrificing their identity to shield the other. It was a concept of absolute vulnerability and equal partnership that the rigid, caste-obsessed laws of the Empire had never even imagined, let alone accepted. The vision shattered, slamming them back into the physical reality of the containment cell. The station gave a violent lurch. The grinding sound of tearing metal echoed through the deck. "We have to go," Rowan said, pulling her to her feet, his eyes locked onto hers with absolute certainty. "Now." "Go where?" Soren demanded, fighting through the lingering vertigo of the network's communion. "The fleet is at the door. The network is tearing the planet apart." Above them, the visual feeds in the corridor showed the horrifying truth. The massive transit gates in the planet's orbit were no longer just vibrating. They were physically ripping the fabric of space. Jagged, chaotic rifts of purple energy were slicing through the orbital defenses, threatening to swallow the capital city whole. The incoming Dravik cruisers were forced to break formation to avoid being pulled into the void. "We are going back up to the Chamber of Solstice," Rowan stated, his voice devoid of any hesitation. "The Council is trapped. They just called a final emergency session because they have absolutely nowhere else to run. The entire system is coming down around their ears, and we are the only two people alive who know how to fix the engine." He held her gaze, offering no grand promises of safety, only the brutal, pragmatic truth of their situation. "We do it together. Equal load. No masters. No sacrifices. Are you with me?" Soren looked at the human who had risked his species, his freedom, and his sanity to stand beside her in the dark. The glowing lines on her skin shifted from a defensive, panicked flare to a deep, resolute, and brilliant blue. "Let us go, tear up their laws," Soren replied. Together, they ran toward the elevators as the floor beneath them began to tear apart. The Chamber of Solstice was tearing itself apart, not just politically, but physically. Dust rained from the cracked white stone ceiling, and the majestic lords who had once sneered at Rowan were now shouting in blind panic. Even as the orbital capital groaned under the gravimetric stress of the collapsing transit gates, the aristocrats clung to their archaic rulebooks. Lord Valen's loyalists demanded order, while the very men who had cowardly refused Soren on the marble dais days earlier were actively citing bloodline purity and traditional safety protocols to avoid taking any decisive action. They were arguing over the color of the curtains while the house burned to the ground. The heavy wooden doors of the amphitheater blew open. Rowan Mercer and Soren Kalis walked down the central aisle. The glowing neural ridges on Soren's skin were no longer an erratic, terrified pulse. They blazed with a unified, blinding sapphire brilliance. Rowan did not wait for the High Magistrate to speak. He stepped into the dead center of the room. He did not ask for a favor. He did not petition for emergency powers. "Your traditions are dead." Rowan's voice carried over the panic, hard and unyielding as iron. "And your temporary stabilization protocols are officially terminated. We are not doing the salvage accord. We are initiating a mirror bond." The chamber fell into a horrified, breathless silence. The mirror bond was a forbidden covenant, outlawed for thousands of years. It was not a temporary logistical bridge. It was a permanent, egalitarian fusion of two minds. If successful, it would completely sever the High Council's administrative override, stripping their absolute monopoly over the portal network forever. Soren would cease to be their living battery. But the stakes were apocalyptic. If the bond failed, the resulting neurological feedback loop would not just kill them both. It would permanently collapse the entire transit infrastructure, turning hundreds of star systems into dark, isolated islands. "You arrogant primate!" one of the core family lords spat, stepping forward. "You will destroy us all. The human mind cannot survive an equal load. Guards, execute them both." Before a single weapon could be drawn, every holographic display in the chamber flashed from emergency red to a stark, undeniable white. Ambassador Tarek Solon had hit the broadcast switch. The unalterable logs from the deepest security vaults spilled across the screens for the entire nobility to read. It laid bare every rigged rejection, every coerced suitor, and the exact coordinates High Magistrate Valen had transmitted to the invading fleet. The conspiracy was naked in the light of day. Valen's face drained of color. He turned toward the private evacuation elevators, but the universe had run out of time. A deafening shockwave slammed into the orbital capital. House Dravik had opened fire. The kinetic bombardment shattered the outer defense rings, sending a violent tremor through the floor that threw half the council to their knees. The central ceiling cracked wide open, exposing the violent, swirling violet storms of the destabilized space-time rifts above them. There was no time for tribunals. There was only the edge of the knife. Rowan turned to Soren. The air between them crackled with raw, unfiltered energy. This was not a romantic embrace. It was two soldiers stepping onto a landmine together. He reached out his hand. Soren looked at his scarred, human fingers, then up at his eyes. She found no fear, no pity, and no desire to dominate her. She found an equal. She locked her hand in his. They did not use the heavy, suffocating diagnostic cables of the medical bays. They bypassed the physical hardware entirely, projecting their combined consciousness directly into the open, bleeding rift above the chamber. The Veil network rushed in to annihilate them. It was a tidal wave of 1 trillion screaming coordinates, burning stars, and infinite darkness. Rowan took the absolute brunt of the initial impact. He used the inherent chaos of his human brain, its evolutionary capacity to endure massive, contradictory noise, to act as a colossal shock absorber. He swallowed the raw terror of the cosmos, buffering the horrific static that had tortured Soren for her entire life. With the crushing noise finally silenced, Soren was free to operate at her true, terrifying potential. With the precision of a master architect, she seized the fragmented, burning pathways of the portal network and began to weave them back together. They did not just repair the gates. They rewrote the entire operating system of the galaxy. Moving in perfect, synchronized harmony, they collapsed the spatial rifts surrounding the Dravik cruisers, trapping the invading fleet in localized gravity wells and rendering their weapons completely useless. Then, they pushed the energy outward, unlocking the heavily restricted civilian corridors and decentralizing the central hubs. The network flowed freely, an open ocean rather than a dammed river. When the blinding light finally faded, the physical damage to the chamber remained, but the apocalyptic pressure in the air was gone. The transit gates stabilized, glowing with a serene, steady gold. Rowan and Soren stood in the center of the ruined amphitheater, their hands still tightly clasped, their breathing heavy but perfectly synchronized. The luminescent lines on Soren's skin had settled into a gentle, rhythmic glow that mirrored the beat of Rowan's human heart. The noble lords, the very men who had dressed in fine silks and offered polite, cowardly apologies, were picking themselves up from the rubble. They stared at the center of the room in absolute, silent awe. They were looking at a human who had dared to shoulder the weight of a god, and the woman they had treated as a terrifying monster. Now, standing as the undisputed, untouchable architect of their civilization, Soren Kalis looked back at the gathered elite. For the first time in her life, she was not a tool, a tragedy, or a rejected outcast. She was truly, finally seen. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed the journey, please subscribe to Sci-Fi Stories, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.